Hey, I'm John Landis. Welcome to the Apprenticeship, where today we're going to continue episodes covering joinery. Thanks for joining me. Welcome to the Apprenticeship, where today we're going to continue to talk about joinery. Last time on the Apprenticeship we talked about edge joint, where we were taking the long grain of the edge of a board and gluing it to the long grain of another edge of the board, therefore creating an edge joint. Now remember, with the glue, that joint was effectively as strong as the wood itself in most cases. A very basic joint. Today we're moving on to a more complicated joint that should sort of open your eyes and frankly open your opportunity to a lot of different kinds of joints. We're going to continue with the concept of being able to glue long grain to long grain, but it's now that we're getting into the heart of woodworking, where we're actually going to manipulate the boards to create joints that will be applicable in different situations, but you're going to need to learn the basics of why it's possible first. Now, from a very basic standpoint, because we can glue long grain to long grain, I could take these two boards and simply place them one over the other and glue it together. Now, structurally, that's a sound joint. Visibly, that's not a very pretty joint. And secondly, I'm not sure how many applications we would have using that joint in woodworking. But it is still that basis, the ability to take long grain and glue it onto long grain, that gets us thinking about what it is we're going to do. What kind of joint can we create using the same physical property of being able to glue long grain to long grain, but how do we pretty it up? How do we strengthen it up? How do we use that joint? How does it apply to us as woodworkers? Now, long grain to long grain joinery is really the basis for so many of the joints we use. First of all, for the lap joint, the half lap joint. We use it for the mortise and tenon joint. We use it partially for dovetail joints, although that's a bit of a mechanical joint as well. We use it in finger joints, box joints. So the idea of long grain being able to glue to long grain is really the basis for all of these joints. But today I'm going to start with the most basic of the long grain to long grain joints, and that is the half lap joint. Now, I very barbarically showed you that this could be glued to that and be called a joint. Believe it or not, this has a name. This is called a full lap joint, basically because one board is being lapped upon the other board. But we want to pretty this up. After all, we're building furniture, we're building nice things. So not only do we want to pretty it up, but we want to be able to apply it to furniture building. And one of the most obvious places where half lap joints are used is in framing, whether it's framing for a picture or framing for a door frame. And that is the same idea of being able to join this board to this board at a 90-degree angle. This being a full lap joint. Well, that'll work, that'll hold, but there's not a lot going on with this joint from a visible standpoint, a visual standpoint, a design standpoint, or a functional standpoint. So how do we take this technology, the ability to glue this face to this face, and turn it into something that is functional for us? Well, the most obvious thing to do is to do a half lap joint. The half lap joint removes half of the material from the back side of one of these pieces and half of the material from the front side of the other, therefore maintaining the long grain here and maintaining the long grain here, thus the glue surface, but making it into a joint such that both members are on the same plane and flush. But this joint also gives us a little bit more strength beyond the glue. And that is in the shoulder that we created here on this piece by cutting away this half lap and the shoulder on this piece that we've created by cutting away the half lap here, we've actually given not only the glue strength of the face to the face, but we've also created a racking situation where this piece won't be able to rack very easily, which means it won't be able to move in this direction without actually breaking the seal of the glue. And oddly enough, the glue holds better this way than it does being able to pull it away. So this half lap joint is using the technology of long grain to long grain, but it is now turned into an actual joint, an actual usable joint, and an actual functional joint that not only looks nice, but serves our purpose in a door frame as well. All right, now we've understood the why we do things. Now we can move on to the how-tos. The why we did things was we wanted to take a long grain glue up and glue it to another long grain. We know that works. We know that's functional. That's the why we do things. Now the how-to. Well, the how-to was we removed half of this material and half of this material, therefore creating our joint. But because we understand the why to, the long grain to long grain, it means that we can take the same joint and open it up to different opportunities. Let's say for some reason we wanted to take this and join it like that in the middle and create a cross. Again, say in the center of a door, say in the side of a panel, or for whatever reason we wanted to do it. We know that because this glue situation works, we know that we can remove half the material from this board and half the material from this board just in the center of the board at this time and make a half lap joint in the middle. Now, how to cut this joint? Well, in this particular case, for the end of the boards, you can do it a couple ways. If you don't have any power tools, we're going to need to do it by hand. So the first thing we're going to want to do is mark the board, mark your shoulder. You're going to need a square, and you're going to need either a pencil or a knife, and of course, your handsaw. Now, you want to take the member of the material that you're going to be removing, hold that right on the end there, put your square up to it. This represents the width of your board here, and either with a pencil, make a mark, or with a knife, make a mark. Now that represents the shoulder of this piece that you're going to cut to. By cutting to this piece is going to set right inside of there, and that's called a shoulder. Then the next thing you're going to want to do is mark down the side of the board half of the distance. In our case, it's 1/4 of an inch. Now, you can measure it if you want to. You can take a scratch awl and mark it that way if you want to. I don't know that you need to be that precise right off the bat, but you need to make sure that you're cutting less than the material that you want to remove, because you're going to pair this with a chisel or with a hand plane or a shoulder plane to get to fine tune that. So unless you're super talented, I would just get close and make sure you're cutting under half of it. So then you're going to want to put that in a vise, and then you'll take your handsaw and, staying on the waist side of the line, go ahead and cut your cheek here. Now you're going to cut all the way down, remove that much of the cheek. Then, clamping this to the bench, you're going to want to now cut your shoulder. Again, with the handsaw, staying off the line. Unless you've done this so many times, your talent is ridiculous and off the charts. You're going to stay off the line cutting that shoulder. Now, that'll end up removing this. You're going to want to hone that in either with a chisel or with a hand plane. Now, because we do have power tools in this shop, we'll remove this material on our table saw. So let's head down to the table saw. So we're to the point in the procedure now where you have milled all of the pieces to, say, a door or frame, whatever you're building. You've milled all of the pieces. You've gone through the rough milling, you've gone through the final milling. If you've watched all of the apprenticeship videos, you know that I've brought this up before. Going through the final milling process, the face jointing, the planing, the edge jointing, the ripping, making all of these pieces consistent, making all of these pieces identical is going to pay off now when we're cutting the joint. We're going to set up this half lap joint on the table saw. Now, obviously, because they're called half laps, we're going to remove half the material from one of our pieces, half the material from the other piece, and create our half lap joint. Now, we'll set this up by putting a dado stack into our saw. We have guessed the height of the dado stack. I know that it wants to be 1/4 of an inch. We've come a little shy of that so that we can sneak up and get the perfect joint. We've set the table saw just off the distance edge of the blade to the thickness of this piece, and we're going to use the sliding miter to make sure that we're passing this piece 90 degrees over the blade. What that's going to do is set us up with a nice shoulder. When we've made this cut, because you've gone through the final milling process and all of these are consistent, once we've made this cut and we've honed in on this joint, we've raised the blade what we need it to be raised to, and we make this joint perfectly, we are going to be able to repeat that joint over and over again. All 4 joints on the door are repeatable, and then every joint on every door is repeatable. If you cut this joint by hand, which of course it can be done, you're basically starting from scratch every time you cut the joint. You'll have to cut the joint with a saw, hone in on it with a hand plane, and sneak up on both of these. The beauty of doing it with a power tool and the beauty of doing it with the dado stack, where all of your referencing, table, fence, sliding miter are all consistent, is this joint is going to be cut fast and consistently. Because we're cutting a half lap joint, we are going to intentionally remove half of the material from the bottom face of this and then half of the material from the top face of this side. We've set our blade just below half so that we can sneak up to that joint. If we need to raise the blade a little bit at a time, we can raise it so that ultimately once the joint is together, we'll have a nice flush surface. Furthermore, you can do this with measurement or with the piece itself. We've set the distance of the fence to the outside of the blade to be the width of this frame member here. You can of course do it by measurement, but we just do it because we actually have the piece here. So next I'm going to fire up the table saw. We're going to remove half the material from the bottom of this one, half the material from the top of this one, and then we'll test the joint. If I need to fudge it a little bit, if I need to hone in on it and make it perfect, that's what we'll do. So from one of the members, we removed half of its thickness. From the other, we removed half of its thickness, and put together, we create the half lap joint. Now you noticed in the middle of the process, I stopped, raised the blade a little bit. My first cut left me with a ridge right here. I hadn't removed enough material and I needed to remove a little bit more. Keep in mind that when you're removing material, you're actually removing twice as much as you think you are. If you have to make an adjustment here of a 32nd of an inch, then you really need to raise the blade a 64th of an inch, because you're going to take a 64th from here and a 64th from here. You'll be surprised if you make this move, raise the blade, and then suddenly you've removed too much material. Now, the beauty of that, I think you saw, is that I needed to make an adjustment in the middle of the cut, and all I did was raise the blade. But because I'm referencing the table, because I'm referencing the fence, I didn't ruin the cut that I had already made. I didn't I didn't change any factor except raising the blade, making this joint perfect. The beauty of it is we just honed in on this joint, and because we final milled all of the pieces at the same time, this joint, this setting is going to be good for this joint, and this joint of this door, and then every door moving forward. That's the beauty of using a table saw when you have an opportunity. Not that this joint can't be cut by hand, because of course it can. It just means you're going to be starting over again at ground zero. All right, so this is going to be the first joint that we use using the idea of gluing the long grain of a face of a board to the long grain of the face of a board. You understand why it works. Now, because you understand why it works, you'll understand when we move on to the next joint, which I haven't decided which one we're going to do yet, probably the mortise and tenon. Seems like the most logical way to go. It's the same exact technology. It's whatever way we can find to effectively glue long grain to long grain. In this case, we took half laps and glued that long grain to that long grain. It's a decent joint. It's a good joint. It's one face being glued to another face. But there may be applications, say chair mortise and tenons or heavier door mortise and tenons, where one face of glue is not going to be enough. Therefore, woodworkers in the past got creative and figured out, how can I get more and more and more faces glued to more faces? Now, there is a balance. You don't want to remove too much material just to get more faces glued together. So it's in that understanding of gluing the faces together that's going to move us on to the next joint, and then the next joint, and the next joint. The more you understand about this technology, the more you get the why we're doing things, the easier it's going to be for you to decide which joint you're going to use and how we're going to cut those joints. So today was about the lap joint, the half lap joint specifically. Join us for the next apprenticeship, where we are going to move on to another joint, but chances are, because there are so many, we're going to use the same concept of long grain to long grain glue up on faces, just in a different application. Thanks for watching.